Hello, everybody. So this week, the decision dropped in the lawsuit for SFFA, Students for Fair Admission. That's that Edward Bloom group, and they were behind the litigation at University of Texas. And I think the perception and maybe the reality here is that this particular lawsuit's maybe a little cynical. Maybe perhaps he doesn't care so much about the well-being of Asian people. He just is looking for a pretense to overturn affirmative action. Now, before I go much further, I want to make it very clear I don't really want this to inspire any bizarre, weird, racist comments or anything like that. But the problem here, and you can question his motivations, the problem here is that Harvard has a bit of a problem on their hands here. And the reason I say that is there's pretty good evidence that they are actually discriminating against Asian people in their admissions process. And because of this trial, we've actually learned a lot more about the way Harvard admits students. And they're doing it in a way that really does look like perhaps there is some bias against Asians that is creeping into the process. So I am actually a left-leaning liberal. I support affirmative action. What I don't support is discrimination against Asian people. And so, boy, I'll tell you, this is just a can of worms. You talk to people about this, and people start sharing all kinds of emotion, and they start pouring other things into their commentary that are not really related to this case. But, it's an emotional issue, and race in America is a very difficult topic. But I'm just going to share my opinion of this ruling and talk about what I think are some of the very problematic things that came out in this case. Now, we know that in this particular case, at the trial level, Harvard has prevailed. They won the case. In a way, that's kind of the worst thing that could happen if you wanted to preserve affirmative action. Why do I say that? I say that because if Harvard had lost, they could just say, yeah, you're right. We were doing the wrong thing there. We're going to do something different going forward. And they probably could have found a constitutionally compliant way to continue using race preferences in admission. Because they lost, then Bloom and his group now can appeal. And so they've got a level of appeal. They're going to appeal to the First Circuit, and then First Circuit's pretty liberal. They're probably going to back up the trial judge here, and then that's going to open the door for this to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. So keep in mind, at the trial level and even at the circuit level, the judges there are really bound by law that's already been established, and they're guided by decisions that have already been made. The Supreme Court, though, can change things. They can actually change the way the law is interpreted. So the way laws work in America is that legislators write them, but the courts interpret them. And what laws mean is what the courts say they mean. So what Bloom and his people want is for this to go to the Supreme Court so they can change the way that laws are interpreted. So as I go through this, I'm going to try to explain as much as I can what the court's doing, what they're thinking in this case. And so it won't all be about things that I see with problems on one side or the other, just sort of explaining things to educate folks. One of the things I hear over and over is people will say, well, Harvard is a private university. They're not a state university. Therefore, the courts can't tell them what to do. Well, here, this is a federal court judging a civil rights case. So civil rights cases tend to be litigated at the federal level. And here what we're talking about is an equal protection issue, which is that all people are entitled to equal protection under the law. So this is the passage from the decision. It's from page 103 in the decision, where the judge explains Harvard College is a component of Harvard University, and yes, we are allowed to take up this case. Now, you can disagree, but again, think back to what I said about the way laws work in America. the way laws work in America is that legislators write them and the courts interpret them. Laws mean what the courts say they mean. The courts say that they have jurisdiction over Harvard, even though it's a private university, and they lay out their reasons, and that's it. So the argument that somehow Harvard is not subject to the laws of the United States, or that courts in the United States have no jurisdiction over Harvard because they're a private university, simply untrue. Says who? Says the courts. So until there's a Supreme Court decision that says that this is not true, the idea that Harvard doesn't have to do what the courts say, or that somehow the courts can't look at this case because Harvard's private, is just untrue. So again, page 103 of the decision. So I'm just going to be going through pages of this decision and trying to explain what they say. And then after I've done that, I'll go ahead and explain what I think are the problems here. So the next thing I hear, which actually the judge said this a couple times, which is funny because she knows better, is people said, well, this Edward Bloom guy does not have the right to sue because he's not Asian, he's not hurt, and he's not showing us any Asian people. This is an issue called standing. Is he allowed to bring the lawsuit? And so the reality is, yes, he does. And so the judge here explains why this is true. And so there are valid reasons why, for instance, a specific Asian person might not want to get up there and stand up and talk about this. I mean, honestly, that girl from the Fisher case, look, she wasn't sympathetic, but you still have a right to go to the courts and try and seek justice. And she was pretty brutally treated. I mean, they called her Becky with the bad grades and all sorts of things like that. So you can see why maybe an Asian person doesn't want to have that kind of abuse. And the other thing was, because Harvard kept all this secret, we didn't really know what was going on. So we needed the trial to see what the process was and to find the exact way that they were discriminating. And so it was really unreasonable for people to say, well, show us an Asian that was harmed by this, because Harvard wouldn't let you know. So we needed the process to do it. And so Harvard went to court, and that's it. So Edward Bloom and, well, not him personally, but SFFA, they did have standing to bring forth this lawsuit. The judge knew that, and that's what the judge said. Next thing I just want to point out, it's the middle sentence here. Harvard's admission program passes constitutional muster in that it satisfies the dictates of strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is the level of scrutiny that racial-based preferences need to be subject to in order to be considered constitutional. The history of strict scrutiny is not great. Strict scrutiny is how we got to throw Japanese people into internment camps. But anyway, this is just the judge saying, Harvard, you won. So when she details how they won, she just basically goes through and says that all of the complaints against them are not valid. So Harvard won on every point here. Their victory couldn't have been more overwhelming in terms of the judge's ruling. So that being said, why do I have a problem with this? The interesting thing to me is that there's a lot of evidence of discrimination, and the judge even acknowledges it. It's not as though this evidence was presented and that the judge either didn't understand it or that she chose to ignore it. She saw this stuff, actually comments on it, and writes it in her decision, and then just comes up with a ruling that seems to really go against the evidence here. So she was in a pickle here. The reason I say that is she looked at this as though she only had two things she could do. She could say that Harvard was fine, or she could destroy affirmative action entirely. I feel like she really missed an opportunity just to say, Harvard, you're mostly fine, but you're clearly discriminating against Asian people here. But that affirmative action isn't on trial. What's on trial here is that you just discriminated against Asian people. So obviously SFFA wants this to be about affirmative action, but this isn't really about affirmative action. This wasn't that I don't know, this wasn't pitting black people against Asian people. This was that Asian people are just held to a different standard than white people. This is just straight discrimination. It's not because of affirmative action, it's because Harvard's racist. And so that's where I feel she really missed a chance here. There was a third way she could have gone. Instead, she felt constrained to go with one of the two ways that the plaintiffs, or that the plaintiff and the defendant were looking for here. So she just went to say, Harvard, you're fine. SFFA, you're wrong. She really could have just said, you know what, neither one of you are right. SFFA, this has nothing to do with affirmative action. This is just a straight discrimination case against Asian people. And she could have gone to Harvard and said, Harvard, you're clearly discriminating here. You need to stop. She didn't do it. She ruled for Harvard. That's going to set up the appeal. And so I feel like she really missed a chance here. Of course, they would have appealed that decision. Or maybe Harvard, I don't know. I think that Harvard would not have appealed that decision. The reason I say that is, ever since this trial, Harvard has been undoing all the racist things they used to do. And because of that, the number of Asians admitted to Harvard has gone from like 17% of the class to I think maybe 25% for this most recent class. Harvard knows that they were racist. They got caught just flat out discriminating against Asian people. And because of this trial, they are starting to undo some of that bigotry. I don't think that this is ambiguous at all. Harvard is flat out racist against Asian people. And it kind of always cracks me up when they'll trot out some Asian person who was admitted to Harvard. And I mean, Asian people do get into Harvard. And then the Asian person who was admitted says, oh, well, there's no discrimination. I support the system. Well, people who win in a corrupt system tend to think that that corrupt system is wonderful. So the fact that they can drag out people that survived the bigoted selection process, that doesn't prove that the process is not bigoted. It means that those were the lucky people who got past it. And so they look back and they say, well, you know, this process is wonderful. That's the way it goes with any bigoted process. You know, the people who benefit from it are going to try to defend it because they won. So, okay, let's talk about why I'm saying with such absolute certainty that Harvard is racist. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is this thing called the sparse country student search. And so here's the deal. If you are Harvard, what you want is a school that has people from all over the country, not just people from New England or not just people from New York City. You want people from all over the country. And so what they do is they identify places in the country where they don't get many applicants. So for instance, they want people from, I don't know, North Dakota or Wyoming or places where they typically don't get a lot of applicants. So they start searching for them. They try and encourage people to apply to Harvard if they're from North Dakota or Montana or whatever. So these sparse country areas, if you live in one of the sparse country areas, then they will lower their SAT score required to make their search list to 1310 if you're white or other or unidentified, right? So typically the scores for people, you know, who get into Harvard are really good on the SAT. If you're from Wyoming and you're a white person, they want to talk to you if you have a 1310. If you're Asian, they don't lower the requirement at all. They leave it at 1350 or 1380, depending on whether you're a woman or a man. So that seems like a small thing, but think about what that's really saying. What that's really saying is that Harvard says that if you're a white person and you are from New York, that you should be viewed as a white person from New York. And if you're a white person from Wyoming, they're saying that a white person from Wyoming isn't really the same thing necessarily as a white person from New York. They may be different. We have to examine the fact that we want these white people from Wyoming, and we're willing to actually lower the SAT score that we set as a threshold in order to try and talk to them and see if they might come to school here. So if you're white, they see you as a person who comes from a place and who has a perspective. If you're Asian, you're just Asian. Asians are Asians are Asians. Doesn't matter where you live. If you're an Asian from Wyoming, they couldn't care less. Doesn't matter. You're the same as any old Asian to them. All Asians are the same. There's no difference in any of them. The only thing that could possibly be interesting about you is that you're Asian, and we don't really care about that. So you're not allowed to have any other aspect of your personality in terms of sparse country. So white people are allowed to be geographically diverse. They're allowed to represent their state. If you're an Asian person, as far as they're concerned, you're not from Montana. You're just Asian. So that is just so offensively racist. Harvard hasn't denied this. And so I just really have difficulty with that they have reduced being Asian to just a state of being where you're not allowed to have a personality, you're not allowed to be from anywhere, you're just an Asian person, and we're just going to glob you in with all Asian people because, just you're Asian. Whereas now a white person, if you're from Montana, that's pretty interesting. You're a white person from Montana. That makes you very different from a white person from New York. If you're an Asian person from Montana, you're just Asian. All Asians are the same. Why would we give a crap whether an Asian person is from Montana or from New York City? Doesn't matter. They're just Asian. So I find that infuriating. This isn't even the worst of it. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the first thing. And ultimately, this is probably one of the least damaging things about this. So let's talk about what else they're doing. So let's talk about the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter here is the discrepancy between the rate at which Asian people are admitted to Harvard versus the rate at which white people are admitted to Harvard. And all it says here, I don't have all the original statistics that Harvard gave to the court, and some of those are still kind of kept secret. But in the ruling, the judge says Asian Americans were admitted to Harvard at slightly lower rates than white applicants. I am stunned. The judge throughout this thing showed remarkably good grasp of statistics, but then she makes ridiculous statements like this. So she says Asian Americans were admitted to Harvard at slightly lower rates than white applicants in the years leading up to the lawsuit. So with between 5 and 6% of Asian Americans and between 7 and 8% of white applicants, that's not slightly lower. That means that white people are 36%, actually a little more than 36%, more likely to be admitted than an Asian person. So I'm just mystified that she would say that that's a slightly lower rate. That's a huge difference. You're 36% more likely to be admitted if you're white. Now, inherently, that's not wrong under certain circumstances. You may want to admit more white applicants if they're just better than the Asian applicants. I mean, what if every Asian applicant were terrible? Then you would admit 0%. And if every white applicant were wonderful, you would admit, I don't know, some amount of them, half of them, I don't know, a third of them. And that wouldn't be proof of racism. That would just be proof that Asian applicants aren't very good and that white applicants are really good. So that's the crux of this. Asians are insanely less likely to be selected than a white person. 36% less likely. I mean, that's just nuts. I can't believe that the judge thinks that that is a slightly lower rate. Now, to get to 36, I just used 5.5% and 7.5%, right? So just used a value in between 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. So the exact number may be something different, but it's like, it's a huge number, whatever it is. Basically, if you're an Asian, your odds of getting in are much lower. That may be okay. So let's take a look at this, because up until this, what was happening was Asians were saying, look, it looks an awful lot to us like you're holding us to a different standard than you're holding white people to. And Harvard would say, we're not. And Asians would say, well, can we look at your your data? And Harvard would say, no, you can't. It's secret, and you're just going to have to trust us. We're not prejudiced. We say so, and then that's going to be the end of it. So, so this case is really what blew the doors open on all this. So now we actually know what's going on. So, okay. So again, Asians, much less likely to get into Harvard, 30-something% less likely, depending on the exact percentage. But I mean, it's a huge disparity. If you are a white applicant, you're 30%. Actually, it's 30% more likely if you're a white applicant. And so, so it just depends. Maybe Asians are just not as good as white people. Maybe Asians are not as deserving of getting into good colleges as white people. So what kind of evidence do we have now that the case is over? So here I'm going to talk about the first thing that they rate students on, and it's called their academic and extracurricular rating. So in this system, Harvard rates people on a number 1, 2, 3, or 4, or not rated. And a rating of 1 or 2 is considered really good. Now, Asians aren't a little better than white people here. They are utterly annihilating white people here. So 60% of Asian applicants got academic ratings of 1 or 2 compared to 46% of white applicants. I mean, that's just not a comparison. Asians have completely annihilated white people on academics. And then when it comes to extracurricular, what they've got, they have a couple different data sets, but 28% of Asians get a 1 or 2 in extracurricular versus 25% of white applicants. And this is in what they call the expanded data set. The expanded data set is what Harvard wanted the court to look at because it includes, people with athletic ability and whose parents are rich and donating money to the school. So there's just not a comparison here. When it comes to academics and extracurriculars, Asian people are just stomping all over the white applicants here. So, the judge makes note that, if they only looked at this, then maybe Asian people, white people shouldn't be 36% more likely to get in than an Asian person. Maybe there would be more Asian people if we only looked at academics and extracurriculars. Now, here I'm going to say Harvard's not wrong. That's not all you want to look at. And there's a lot of game playing. And, I have a friend who knows a lot of Asian people, and he says, man, I got to tell you, these people are pretty reprehensible. Like, they will cheat almost any way they can to try and pump up, like they'll put them in bogus clubs and they'll jerk around with the classes they take and move them into different schools and blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, I mean, Asian people are playing games to pump up their GPA and inflate their extracurriculars. Where I have a problem, though, is do they honestly think that white people don't do that? Really? Like, they think that white people in America are like these completely innocent, naive boobs that are just wandering into this process. I mean, look, everybody who's applying to Harvard, at least when you're talking about well-off Asian and white people, or just, even middle-class Asian and white people, they're aware that this is hyper-competitive. They're trying to get some advantage. So, and I got to tell you, there's nothing stopping white people from doing this either, and they are doing it. White people are gaming the system as much as Asian people are. I really would need to be persuaded that white people are just blindly bumbling their way through life and have no idea of what makes a college application look great. So measure number 1, Asians are just killing white people, but then Harvard says, but wait, we measure people on more than that. And that's right. They should, right? This shouldn't just be about how good you are at taking a test and how good you are at making sure that you take classes that give you a super high GPA. Harvard wants to know that the people that they're getting are also quality people. So after this, they have a personal rating. And that's where the problems start. But again, the 2 numbers we know is that if you're white, you have an astoundingly larger percentage chance that you're going to go to Harvard than if you're Asian. And the second number we know is that by an almost equally astoundingly large amount, Asians are just trouncing white people when it comes to academics and extracurriculars. So, what Harvard is basically saying is, yeah, these Asians, they have good grades. Their academics are really strong. Their test taking strong. They have good extracurriculars, but personally, they are inferior to white people. And so, the way that they're saying this, and of course, they're not saying that explicitly, but what they're saying is Asians have lower personal scores than white people do. And so, for instance, in this case, they say that Asians have a personal rating, 22.6% have a personal rating of 1 or 2, whereas Asians, it's only 18%. So, what they're saying is that there's something about Asians that make them less, I don't know, appealing as an overall human. Now, keep in mind throughout this process, Harvard doesn't tell you which percent they ascribe to each of these measures in terms of their admissions decision. So for instance, you won't get them to say the academics are 40% and the extracurriculars are 10%. They just refuse to say. They just say it's all in there and we just look at it all. So again, that makes it very difficult to understand what they're doing or why they're doing it. So they're just saying that, well, yeah, I mean, Asians are destroying white folks, but they're just not as personally appealing. Now you'll notice that the difference between the personal ratings is nowhere near the difference between the academic and extracurricular ratings. So for this to justify admitting fewer Asian Americans, Harvard would have to have some type of weight for the personal rating that's like 3 times more important than academics and extracurriculars. And, maybe that's possible. Maybe, I don't know though. I gotta believe that your extracurriculars and your academics are probably the most important thing they look at. But if they're saying that this accounts for the disparity, they're saying that this personal rating is way, 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 way more important than academics and extracurriculars. So why are Asians doing so poorly? I mean, maybe this is valid. Maybe Asians just have defective personalities and they're not good human beings, and white people are virtuous with awesome personalities, and Asians are cowardly and white people are brave, and Asians are just, followers and white people are leaders. So how are they calculating this personal rating? And this is where just every step of the way, it's just infuriating. So let's take a look. What they say that they're doing the personal rating on is a few different factors, and let's talk about those factors. So the very next thing that the judge mentions is that the personal ratings are composed of teacher and guidance counselor recommendations. So they say white applicants tend to score slightly stronger than Asian Americans on the school support ratings. So that's part of it. I mean, all right. So wow, I didn't know that. Maybe teachers and guidance counselors just think white people are just vastly superior to Asian people. I mean, who knew? So then she says that, again, she does admit that that these tend to be score slightly stronger. 31.9% of white applicants received a teacher 1. So they get ratings from 2 teachers. Teacher 1 rating of 1 or 2 compared to 31.6% of Asian American applicants. 31.9% compared to 31.6%. That's the same number. That's like a rounding error. I mean, compared to the monster disparities in extracurricular and academics. Now remember, this is just a component of the personality rating. So they're saying that, I don't know, what is that, like 1/3%? It's some ridiculously small amount of difference there is contributing to this monster difference in the personal rating. And so then they say for the teacher 2 rating. So apparently, maybe Asians can only find one teacher that likes them. Maybe every other teacher in the school thinks that they're a big bunch of jerks. So here they said that for the teacher 2 rating, 33.6 of white applicants received a rating of 1 or 2 compared to 32.3% of Asian American applicants. I mean, good Lord, those numbers are, I mean, for all intents and purposes, those numbers are the same. They're within a percent or so of each other. We're not talking about like and now keep in mind a percent or two when you're talking about the difference between 33.6 and 32.3%. That's like a 3 or 4% difference. That's not the 36% difference that we had in academics and extracurriculars. So the idea that this explains any of the discrepancy in the personal ratings is really kind of ridiculous. And so then the judge even mentions, and I'm not sure where she's coming from here. She says, although these differences may appear slight, they're significant in that the stronger high school academic and extracurricular performance of Asian American applicants on average would lead one to expect that those applicants would receive stronger teacher and guidance counselor recommendations than white applicants. What in the world is she saying? I mean, I think she's right. If Asians perform better academically and extracurriculars, and keep in mind, Harvard, they're not idiots. They're not just saying like, oh, you were captain of the Tiddlywinks team. That is equivalent to being captain of the engineering society. I mean, they're looking at these things. They're not fools. So they're rating these things. And so the judge is saying, well, the Asians are doing so good academically, and then we would expect that they should have stronger teacher and guidance counselor recommendations. The first thing that would jump out on me there is if kids are doing better academically and the teachers are not reflecting that in their ratings, there's probably inherent racism. What I'm almost thinking the judge is thinking here is that, look, Asians are way better academically, but then the teachers rate them the same. So because the teachers only rate them the same as white people, Asians must be horrible humans. Think about that for a sec. I think that's what she might be saying here, is that, well, if Asians were good people, then the teachers would rate them way higher than white people, and because they did so much better than white people academically. I think that's what she's saying, is that, and I think she's saying that the reason the teachers aren't rating them higher is because Asians are horrible people. I really think that's what she's saying. That, they should get higher ratings, and the reason they don't is that they're horrible people. Now, keep in mind, they're not getting low ratings. They're getting almost identical ratings to what white people get. The ratings are essentially not different. So this is a case of, well, you've done just as well as white people, but because your grades were better, we're going to hold this against you. So it's nonsensical. It's just infuriating. So basically, really no difference in the teacher and guidance counselor ratings, and most certainly not enough to justify the monster disparity in the overall personal rating. So what's the real reason Asians score lower on the personal rating? Let's get to that. So the only other thing that they really include that they talk about, and there may be more factors here, but there's an interview. A Harvard alum will interview you, and that gets put into your personal rating, and it looks like all they said there was that the Harvard alums say that Asians are about the same. So of the factors that they've been willing to talk about, there's no reason for Asians to be any lower, and yet Asians get coded 25% worse than white people on the personal rating. There's nothing about that makes any sense based on the information we've got. Why would they be rated lower? It doesn't make sense. The two things that they mention, Asians are identical. Their scores should be, I don't know, like imperceptibly lower than the white people's on this. It's, white people's is 25% higher. It's, at best, a percent, 2%, 3%, I don't know, but some very small number, and instead it's 25% higher. Harvard doesn't have an explanation for this. So draw your own conclusions. Just mysteriously, Asians do extremely well academically and in extracurriculars. And then on their personal rating, on the things we can measure, the teacher recommendations and guidance counselor recommendations and the interview, they're essentially identical to white people, and then white people get rated 25% higher. Now, this is where things just start getting bizarre. Apparently, there's various ratings. So there's the academic rating, the extracurricular rating, the personal rating, and then the athletic rating. Now, when I say the athletic rating, I'm not talking about athletic rating of people who are going to Harvard to be athletes. That's a completely different thing. They are recruited as what they call ALDC. So it's essentially a different process. And if you are a recruited athlete, that you're going to play football for Harvard, or you're going to be on their sailing team, or row for their crew team. I don't actually know what sports are at Harvard, but I presume they have a lot of sports. But if you're going to represent the school in a sport, you're a recruited athlete. They don't give athletic scholarships. They just lower the the requirements to get in. They just, you're more likely to get in. In fact, recruited athletes, I think, are accepted like at an 80% rate. So it's just a completely different process. What we're talking about here is people who go to Harvard with no intention of playing a sport at Harvard. That is no part of why they go to Harvard. And then they're rating them on what kind of high school athlete they were. So what Harvard is saying is that they rate people on academics, they rate people on extracurriculars, they rate people on like their personality, and then they also rate them on how good of an athlete they were in high school. On this measure, Asians don't do very well. And so now, I mean, they're the worst of the bunch. They're not ridiculously worse than African Americans. Who knew that African Americans weren't very athletic? And, sort of like Asians and African Americans and Hispanics are just sort of all sitting there at the bottom. And of those three, the Asians are the worst. They're somebody's got to be last. In this case, it's the Asians. And then white people are apparently insanely athletic. So why is that? Well, it's because there's a lot of rich white people sports that are basically only played by rich white people. They're not accessible to other people. A lot of these Asians who are applying to Harvard, I mean, some of them are rich kids, right? There are rich Asian people in the world, but some of them are, children of first generation immigrants, or they're children of actual immigrants. So not every Asian who applies is really wealthy. So much like African Americans and probably Hispanics, they can't play a lot of these rich white people sports. And who knows? I mean, I guess you can get in some kind of weird racist thing here, I've noticed that, I don't know, just like, who knows? So on this measure, they do poorly. And then Harvard argues that this is one of four things that they measure people on. Now, again, Harvard won't tell you what the weights of these things are. They just say, we look at these things, and then they refuse to say that there's a formula or anything. And so what happened was, when they got called on it, they claim basically that sports, high school sports, again, not talking about sports that you would play at Harvard. That's a totally different admissions track. This is, I want to be a school teacher. I'm going to go to Harvard to be a school teacher. They're going to look at what sports I played in high school. Harvard is claiming with a straight face that the sports you play in high school are as important as your academics. There is no possible way that's true. Now, why do I say that that's their claim? Let's take a look. So, as crazy as this sounds, it's true. Each side had their own expert. And Professor Card was Harvard's person. So he crunched their numbers and tried to come up with arguments. And so the question is like, wow, none of these numbers add up at all. Like, I know Harvard that you claim that, there's no formula, but how is it that Asians are great or as good as white people in every measure except for sports, and that you end up, that sports of, again, not college athlete sports, those guys do great on admissions. We're just talking about a person that is not going to do anything athletic at Harvard. They want to know what high school sports they played. Like, oh, they ran cross country in high school. So Card is Harvard's expert. And so in order to try and explain why Harvard doesn't let Asians in the same way they let white people in, he comes with this model where he says that all the weights are equal. So academics is as important as the personal rating, which I don't think that's true. There are not very many people at Harvard with low academics, right? So, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe they can no, everybody here has great academics and they're great. They have a great personal score. But everything in his model, he set all of them to equal weight, which means that the high school sport you play is of equal importance as your academics. And then on top of that, though, so the extracurriculars of white people and Asians are equal. And I mean, sports is an extracurricular. They're just measuring a specific kind of extracurricular that favors white people here. And they're saying that it's as important as academics. There is no possible way that playing some high school sports is equally as important as your academics when applying to Harvard. But that was how badly they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar there, that the only way that they could avoid just throwing in the towel and saying, you're right, we are just unbelievably racist, was to just say maybe if we cook up this model where we just say that sports are every bit as important as your grades, then this will explain it. But also, this is why Harvard wanted to use the extended data set that included athletes, because athletes definitely get admitted. So they wanted to include sports in there. So, but again, even when we're not talking about recruited athletes, so not recruited athletes, they're never going to play sports at Harvard. They're saying that high school sports is as important as academics. They're lying. I can't believe the judge just didn't find them in contempt. I mean, at this point, she should have been like, if that's the best you've got, you guys are just completely wrong. So maybe you agree with Harvard and you think that high school sports are of equal weight to a person's academic ability. But I think that it strains credibility, to say the least. Now, this one I think is just hilarious. The judge determines that there was no discrimination because the testimony of the admissions officers was that there was no discrimination. Basically, Harvard said there's no discrimination there, therefore they really can't be. Oh, dear. So this is where I just disagree with the judge. The judge could have just said, look, this isn't about affirmative action. You're just putting in athletics, and then you're lying and saying that it's way, way more important than academics. And the reality is, first off, we know you're lying. Stop it. I should hold you in contempt. But the second thing is, what you've done is you've put in an irrelevant measure that has a disparate impact, right? So disparate impact is one of the things that can happen where you put in something where you didn't intend to discriminate, but it hurts a specific racial group of people. And so what she could have done was said, look, this is not an affirmative action case, but your system of selection is inherently racist and you're lying about it. And you need to stop lying. And secondly, there's no reason for you to measure the athleticism of a person who's majoring in economics. I mean, they're not going to run the 100-meter dash while they're doing economics. And so then she goes on to note, and really throughout this, I think what really is happening, do I think that Harvard is just like, we don't like Asian people, we don't want a lot of Asian people here? I gotta tell you, I think that might be in there, but I think what's happening instead is that these are just like subconscious biases, and implicit bias. And then the other thing is, I really do think that elite schools don't want to be 40% Asian, which is what they end up being when you stop taking race into account in admissions. And Harvard at the time of this, I think when the lawsuit was filed, Harvard was maybe 17% Asian, something like that, which is a ridiculously low number because the amount of Asians in the country has just exploded. And you can tell Harvard was really trying to keep a lid on that. So the judge kind of makes it clear here, like, look, I see what's going on here. You better do something about it. This is like a very gentle slap on the wrist to give Harvard a chance to fix their stuff. And Harvard has been doing it. The most recent class at Harvard, I think, was 25% Asian. So they've realized that this is under a microscope now. They got caught doing something just utterly reprehensible, and they know that they cannot keep pushing this just very clear discrimination against Asian people. So they're changing their ways. Now, I think they need to change their ways even more, but the judge, I think, just was not going to throw out affirmative action. Now, the other thing is that as a trial judge, as the first trier of fact, she's not really in a position to throw out affirmative action. That is, right now, that is the law of the land, that you can have race-based preferences in college admissions. So even if personally she was thinking like, ooh, these race-based preferences are abhorrent, which I don't think she believes, but even if she did believe it, she is not allowed to just come up with a ruling that is against current law. So what she did was she upheld affirmative action because she didn't want to just take a flamethrower to it. And honestly, this evidence is just so damning to Harvard. They could not have looked worse here. And I'm not even touching on like the ALDC admits. So like the fact that you can basically just buy your way into Harvard if you're rich enough or you come from an influential enough family. And the fact that, I mean, a lot of their athletes are not, we're not talking about basketball stars and football stars and baseball players here. These are stars in very obscure sports where only rich white people basically play them. So there's a lot more. Like, believe it or not, this gigantic long film is just the tip of the iceberg. This is not even the worst of it. It's so much worse than even this when you look at the whole picture. But I feel like even through all that, she was like, look, I have to find a way to uphold affirmative action, but I can't just let them go on this. I mean, they are caught red-handed here. This is ridiculous. So she does what she can to save affirmative action, and she acknowledges that this is a really problematic situation. And she's noting that Harvard's really kind of scrambling behind the scenes to try and fix these things. And so it's going to be interesting to see. I think this is going to the Supreme Court. I think Harvard's conduct here is just utterly reprehensible. If this were almost any other institution and any other minority group of people, this would just be outrageous. I mean, it's still outrageous. It's just people don't care. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens here. But I'm just disgusted by the whole thing. I think that I can't imagine how things could have gone worse for Harvard in this. And I don't know. I think the judge just missed a great opportunity to say both sides are wrong. This has nothing to do with race-based affirmative action. This is just Harvard being a bunch of racists. And she could have smacked Harvard down without giving Bloom and the SFFA the relief that they were looking for, and just said, look, you've hurt Asian people, not as a result of affirmative action. You've just hurt them because you're racist and you have to stop. But instead, Bloom wanted her to throw out affirmative action, and Harvard wanted her to say nothing was wrong. And she picked from those two. And really, when you look at it in that context, she probably made the right choice, because it's a lot closer to nothing wrong than it is to affirmative action being to blame. Affirmative action didn't have anything to do with this. This is just Harvard acting like a bunch of racists. So we'll see where it goes. So that's my take on it. Please try to be civil in the comments, and good luck to everybody. Have a great one. Bye.